Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me say from the outset that a history of racial discrimination in housing is a real and sad part of our nation's history. We can't ignore that. It's a fact. It's also a fact that government policies contributed to this discrimination very significantly. Some federal government policies were, in fact, designed to increase segregation. We all know, and the chairman alluded to, the fact that the FHA engaged in redlining practices where for decades FHA insurance was often limited to newer developments outside of inner city neighborhoods, exacerbating segregation. We also know that Davis-Bacon wage requirements were designed to protect white union labor and to prevent blacks from competing for federally funded construction jobs. Even today, Davis-Bacon continues to impede lower income and minority workers from opportunities, and it drives up the construction costs for government assisted housing. We also know that some state and local government policies have contributed to exacerbating segregation. Some zoning practices, such as prohibitions on multifamily housing and minimum lot sizes, can have legitimate purposes for many communities. However, they sometimes do great harm. They can price low income and minority families out of neighborhoods, and they reduce the supply of affordable housing for these families. Many of the markets with the most severe shortages in affordable housing have the most restrictive regulatory barriers to housing development. In San Francisco, for example, zoning regulations may have been responsible for more than 50% of total housing costs, according to one National Bureau of Economic Research study. In my view, this history shows us that when it comes to housing in America, including housing discrimination, government has often been the problem, not the solution. And unfortunately, the Biden administration does not seem to have learned this lesson. Its new multi-trillion-dollar welfare plan with a bit of infrastructure sprinkled in seems designed to repeat many of the great mistakes of the New Deal and Great Society. After Congress has just finished spending more than $80 billion for housing in response to COVID, on top of the $50 billion we spend annually on HUD programs alone, not to mention the many billions we spend on other housing programs, then there's the tens of billions at least that we forego in tax revenue to subsidize housing. Now, in addition to all of that, the Biden administration is calling for $213 billion in new spending for housing in its so-called infrastructure plan. Amazingly, the administration wants Congress to spend $40 billion to restore public housing projects, places where people generally don't want to live. Housing projects are notorious concentrations of poverty, crime, and other social ills. And research shows that moving families out of housing projects and integrating them into broader communities decreases violent crime. But rather than focus on sensible alternatives, the Biden administration wants to keep families in housing projects. More public housing will only commit more Americans to a substandard living arrangement and increase government dependency. We also should not rush to put families in homes they can't afford. Relaxing underwriting requirements or expanding down payment assistance programs for low-income families, especially in an overheated housing market, is a recipe for disaster. If home values drop, and eventually they very well may, these borrowers run the very real risk of losing their homes and any wealth they thought they had accumulated. And we've seen this happen before. Most recently during the 2008 housing crisis, when government monetary and housing policy created a housing bubble, the bursting of which caused the financial crisis and then the Great Recession. The administration's infrastructure plan also calls for $20 billion in tax credits for building and rehabilitating homes and making them more energy efficient. These tax credits will inevitably predominantly benefit developers and investors, largely because they're not targeted to low-income families. In fact, homes built with tax credits can be sold to purchasers with income up to 140% of the area median income, not the poverty level. The administration's plan also prioritizes using union labor to upgrade homes, and this unfairly excludes lower-income, non-unionized laborers, and it increases construction costs that will inevitably be passed on to homeowners. Today, we're going to hear from two witnesses who will discuss how government intervention, even well-meaning, has contributed to inequality. Howard Hussock is a housing researcher and scholar. Mr. Hussock will note many race-conscious policies haven't actually increased homeownership opportunities or wealth in underserved communities. Public housing has deprived many minority communities of the opportunity to build wealth. Community Reinvestment Act is out of date and poorly designed to encourage lending in minority neighborhoods, and it doesn't track whether investments actually help or hurt families. And an overly prescriptive affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements that put only a handful of low-income families in subsidized rental homes in affluent areas does little to support minority families or help them build wealth through home ownership. We'll also hear from Tobias Peter, an expert in housing finance. He notes that policies aggressively encouraging low income or minority people to buy homes, especially during a boom when houses are very expensive, exposes borrowers to greater default risk during dips in the market. He argues that risky lending harms low-income borrowers who purchase homes when home prices are inflated, and he believes that local governments need to remove zoning restrictions and other regulatory barriers to housing that artificially constrain the supply of housing and drive up costs. It's important to remember that the legacy of discrimination is often a direct result of government-supported policies. As we consider how to address the housing challenges we face, we should not repeat the mistakes of the past. Now is not the time to double down on failed effort, and that means we should not keep American families in dilapidated and segregated housing projects. We should not let bureaucrats in Washington make local housing decisions that undermine communities, and we should not inappropriately push families to purchase homes they can't afford in the long run. The lesson we need to learn and apply is, when it comes to housing in America, government has often been the problem, not the solution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.